May 1944. The mountains of central Italy. A German infantry captain named Wolfgang Heinz is writing a field report. He has been on the Italian front for 7 months. He has fought Americans. He has fought British. He has fought New Zealanders and South Africans and Canadians and Poles. He knows what each of them feels like in combat. He is writing about something different. His unit, the 90th Panzer Grenadier Division, veterans of North Africa and the Eastern Front, has just been relieved from a sector of the line near the Rapido River. In 7 months on the Italian front, through Cassino and the winter line and the fighting withdrawal up the spine of the Italian peninsula, Heinz has written field reports that are professional, precise, and unemotional. This report is different. He writes, night operations in our sector have changed in character. When other Allied units are opposite us, the night is controllable. Patrols can be planned for. Sentries have a reasonable expectation of seeing what is coming. He pauses. The next sentence takes him 3 attempts. He writes, against these troops, the night is theirs completely. They move in darkness in a manner I cannot explain and cannot prepare for and cannot counter. In 6 weeks in this sector, we have lost 19 men from sentinel positions. In each case, the sentry was not shot. In each case, the sentry was killed silently at close range with a bladed weapon. In each case, the other sentries at adjacent posts heard nothing. He stops. He looks at what he has written. He adds one final sentence. I do not know how to train my men against an enemy they cannot hear coming. He was not the first German officer to write something like this. He was not the last. Almost identical reports exist in the Italian campaign records from German units who faced this particular formation. The language is always the same. Professional men trying to find clinical words for something that had stopped feeling clinical. The unit Captain Heinz was writing about was not American. It was not British in the conventional sense. It was not Russian or German or French or any of the national armies that fill the standard histories of the Second World War. It came from a place that most people in 1944 could not have found on a map without difficulty. It was made of men who had been recruited from the hill villages of a small Himalayan kingdom, men who had been recruited from those same villages by the British Army for 130 years, who had fought in every British campaign of the 19th and 20th centuries, who had a relationship with the British military that was not colonialism in the simple sense and not partnership in the simple sense, but something that combined elements of both in proportions that historians are still arguing about. They were called Gurkhas, and by 1944, after 3 years of the Second World War, after fighting in North Africa and Hong Kong and Malaya and Burma and Italy, they had produced in the collective military consciousness of every army that had faced them, German, Italian, Japanese, a reaction that was functionally the same regardless of the army producing it. Fear, specific, documented, consistent, not the ordinary operational fear that soldiers feel about a dangerous enemy, something more particular, something that kept appearing in the reports and the letters and the prisoner interrogations of men from 3 completely different military cultures who had never compared notes, something that the German captain in the mountains above the Rapido River was still trying to find words for on a May evening in 1944 in a field report that no one read for 50 years. This is the story of who they were and why they produced that reaction of the weapon they carried that became the most recognized symbol of a military culture that most of the world knew almost nothing about, of the battles They fought in theaters so different that they seem like different wars, and of the question that sits at the center of their history that has never been answered. Without discomfort, why did they fight so hard for someone else's empire? To understand the Gurkhas, you have to understand Nepal in the 19th century. And to understand Nepal, you have to understand what it means to be a small, landlocked mountain kingdom surrounded by powers that want what you have. Nepal in 1814 was an expanding military state. The Gurkha kings, the Shah dynasty, had unified Nepal by conquest in the 1760s and had continued expanding east and west and south, absorbing smaller kingdoms and pushing against the frontiers of British India to the south and Chinese Tibet to the north. In 1814, they pushed too far south. They crossed into territory the British East India Company considered its own. The Anglo-Nepalese War began. What happened over the next 2 years surprised everyone. The British expected to overwhelm Nepal quickly. Nepal was small. The British had artillery. The British had numbers. The British had the institutional experience of 50 years of Indian campaigning. What the British did not have was experience fighting in the Himalayan foothills, steep, forested terrain where artillery could not be moved, where supply lines were impossible to maintain, where the advantage of numbers was neutralized by the ground itself. The Gurkha soldiers, drawn from the hill tribes of Nepal, particularly the Magar, Gurung, Rai, and Limbu peoples, fought on that ground the way men fight on terrain they grew up running across. The British lost battle after battle in the first year. They lost officers. They lost supply columns. They lost garrison after garrison to night attacks they could not predict or defend against. The British general who finally achieved success in the campaign, General David Ochterlony, did it by adapting British tactics to Gurkha terrain rather than expecting Gurkha terrain to accommodate British tactics. He won. The Treaty of Sugauli in 1816 ended the war and ceded territory to the British. But the more consequential thing that came out of the Anglo-Nepalese War was not the territory. It was the British assessment of the men they had been fighting. British officers writing about the Gurkha soldiers after the campaign used language that was unusual in 19th century military reporting. It was not the language of imperial condescension that filled most British assessments of Indian soldiers. It was something closer to professional respect expressed with genuine surprise. General Ochterlony wrote that the Gurkha soldiers possessed qualities that he had encountered in no other troops in 30 years of Indian service. He wrote that their combination of physical endurance, tactical instinct, and what he described as an indifference to personal danger, that was not recklessness, but something more considered, the behavior of men who had made a prior decision about their own mortality and were no longer being distracted by it, made them unlike anything in his experience. The British made a decision. They would recruit them. The Gurkhas made a decision. They would allow it. What followed was one of the most unusual military relationships in the history of modern warfare. A relationship that would produce, 130 years later, the men whose night operations in the Italian mountains were leaving German captains unable to find adequate words. Before we go further into the history, I need to tell you about the weapon, because the weapon is the reason for the particular quality of the fear. The kukri is a curved blade, typically between 12 and 18 inches long, with a distinctive inward curve near the handle that gives the forward section of the blade enormous chopping weight. It is not primarily a stabbing weapon. It is a slashing and chopping weapon designed so that the weight of the forward blade does most of the work. A skilled user can sever a limb with a single blow. A skilled user in close quarters at night is something that military men who had faced the kukri consistently described in terms that went beyond tactical assessment into something more visceral. Every Gurkha soldier carried one, not as a ceremonial weapon, as a working tool and a fighting knife that was treated with a specific cultural significance that went beyond its function as a weapon. There is a tradition about the kukri that every Gurkha understood and that every enemy who had read the reports eventually learned. The tradition holds that once a kukri is drawn from its scabbard, it must draw blood before it is returned. If no enemy is available, the user draws the blade across his own thumb. Whether this tradition was followed in practice in every case is something historians debate. What is not debated is the effect the tradition had on the enemy when they learned of it, and the enemy always learned of it. A weapon that its owner is culturally committed to using once it is drawn is a different tactical proposition from a weapon that might or might not be used depending on circumstances. Every German soldier in the Italian mountains who had been briefed on Gurkha tactics knew about the kukri tradition. The briefing, intended to be practical, had the additional effect of confirming what the night patrols had already communicated. These men would not stop. The German army's formal intelligence assessment of the Gurkhas, circulated in Italy in 1943, described the kukri in clinical terms and then added a sentence that was not clinical. It said that the psychological effect of the weapon on soldiers who had been briefed on its use was significant and that commanding officers should be aware of this effect when assigning units to sectors where Gurkha formations were operating. The German army was officially warning its own officers that their men were afraid of a knife. When war broke out in September 1939, Nepal was not a British colony. It was an independent kingdom with a treaty relationship with Britain. Its soldiers served in the British Indian Army under a specific arrangement that gave the British the use of Gurkha military manpower in exchange for pay, pensions, and treatment that was materially better than what comparable service in Nepal could offer. The Gurkha soldiers who chose to enlist, and it was a choice, a genuine one, made by men who came from a culture that valued military service as a path to income, status, and adventure in a country that had limited alternatives for a young man from a hill village, were making a calculation that their fathers and grandfathers had made before them. When war came, the 10 Gurkha rifle regiments of the British Indian Army expanded massively. By 1945, over 250,000 Gurkha soldiers were serving in the British Indian Army, more than 10 times the pre-war strength. They served in almost every theater of the Second World War. They fought in North Africa, in Italy, in France, in the Middle East, in Malaya, in Singapore, in Burma. They earned, in those theaters, 2,734 battle honors, 10 Victoria Crosses, dozens of distinguished conduct medals, a casualty rate that reflected, above all other statistics, the nature of the fighting they were sent into, because Gurkha units were consistently assigned to the hardest tasks, the night operations, the close-quarter assaults, the infiltration behind enemy lines, the work that required exactly what the British had been recruiting them for since 1816. In each theater, the reaction was the same. Let me tell you about 3 of them. In the North African campaign, Gurkha units served primarily in the 4th Indian Infantry Division, one of the most decorated formations in the entire British order of battle. The Germans who faced them in the Western Desert had not encountered Gurkhas before. The Afrika Korps had fought the British Army in France and the British and Commonwealth forces in North Africa for over a year before they first encountered units with the crossed kukri's shoulder badge. The learning curve was steep, and it ran in the wrong direction for the Germans. German prisoners captured in North Africa and interrogated by British intelligence officers in 1942 and 1943 were asked routinely about their experience. Of different Allied units, the intelligence officers were looking for information about morale, about which Allied units the Germans rated as dangerous and which they did not take seriously. The Gurkhas came up in these interrogations with a consistency that the intelligence officers noted explicitly in their summary reports. German prisoners did not describe Gurkha units the way they described other Allied formations. They described them in terms that the intelligence officers, in their summary reports, characterized as indicative of an unusual level of apprehension. One interrogation transcript, partially declassified and available in the British National Archives records, a German NCO who had served in the Western Desert, describing a night patrol encounter with the Gurkha unit. His account was detailed and specific. He said that his patrol had detected movement, had called a challenge, and had received no response. In the silence that followed the challenge, a silence that lasted perhaps 3 seconds by his account, he said that his patrol had made the decision to withdraw. The interrogating officer asked why they had not engaged. The German NCO said, because they had not fired. If they had fired, we would have known where they were. The absence of fire was more frightening than fire would have been. That is the specific quality of the fear. An enemy that shoots at you occupies a predictable, tactical space. An enemy that does not shoot, that moves in darkness without sound, that is close enough to have killed several sentries without any adjacent sentry hearing, occupies a different kind of space. It occupies the space inside your own head. The Italian campaign from September 1943 to May 1945 was the grinding war that the Allied High Command consistently described as secondary to the main event. In France and the Allied press consistently underreported because the terrain and the pace produced battles that did not photograph as victories. For Gurkha units, Italy was different. The mountains of central Italy, the Apennine spine, that the Germans used as a series of defensive positions, the Winter Line, the Gothic Line, the individual mountain peaks that had to be taken one at a time by infantry who could not be supported by armor because the ground did not allow it, were, in their essential character, like the terrain the Gurkhas had grown up in: mountain warfare, closed country, night movement, the premium on individual soldier capability rather than firepower and mechanization. The Gurkhas in Italy were in their element in a way that was not true of any other Allied formation. In November 1943, the 1 of 9 Gurkha rifles were tasked with taking Monte Camino, a mountain peak, in the Winter Line that the Germans had fortified over several months and that previous British attacks had failed to take. The assault was conducted at night. The Gurkhas moved without artillery support for the final approach because artillery would have given away the axis of attack. They moved through terrain that German planners had assessed as impassable at night. They reached the German positions before the defenders knew they were coming. What followed was close-quarter fighting of the kind that Italian campaign veterans consistently described as the worst they experienced, not because of firepower or numbers, but because of what it was like when the fighting was at arm's length in the dark. The Gurkhas took Monte Camino. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the German commander in Italy, one of the most capable defensive commanders of the entire war, wrote in his post-war memoirs about the difficulty of defending against Gurkha mountain troops in a way that was, coming from Kesselring, notable. He did not praise Allied formations casually. He described the Gurkhas as presenting a tactical problem that he had not been able to solve satisfactorily in 2 years of Italian campaigning. He said that standard defensive doctrine, depth, mutual support between positions, the use of observation to trigger defensive fire did not work adequately against troops who could move across terrain that the defensive doctrine assumed was impassable. A field marshal was telling his post-war readers that he had run out of answers. The third theater where the Gurkhas fought, and the one that produced perhaps the most extreme version of the reaction they generated, was Burma. Burma was different from North Africa and Italy in almost every way. Different terrain, different enemy, different climate, different tactical logic. The Japanese army in Burma was, by the consensus of every military assessment made during and after the war, among the most formidable fighting forces Japan produced. Japanese soldiers in Burma had demonstrated at Malaya and Singapore and in the initial Burma campaign of 1942 that they were capable of sustained offensive operations through terrain that their opponents had assessed as impassable. The Japanese infantryman of 1942 and 1943 was physically tough, tactically skilled, and operating within a military culture that regarded surrender as a disgrace that brought shame to the soldier's family. He would fight to the last round and beyond it. Japanese soldiers in Burma had a name for the Gurkhas. The name was used in field communications and prisoner interrogations and in the personal letters that Japanese soldiers sent home from Burma when the postal system still functioned. The name translates approximately as the small men who are not afraid to die. It was not an insult. It was an acknowledgement. The particular quality of the acknowledgement becomes clearer when you understand what it meant for Japanese soldiers in a military culture built on the willingness to die in an army that had demonstrated that willingness across 3 years of Pacific fighting to identify a specific enemy formation as distinguished by their indifference to death. They were saying, even by our standards, even by the standards of an army that had made the willingness to die into a central military virtue, even by those standards, these small men from the Himalayan hills were something else. The battles in Burma produced specific documented moments of this quality. In March 1945, during the advance toward Mandalay, a company of the 3 of 6 th Gurkha rifles was ordered to take a Japanese strongpoint on a feature called Snowdon East, a fortified hill position that had repulsed 2 previous assaults by different units. The company commander was Captain Michael Almond, 22 years old, from a family with a long military tradition, commissioned into the Indian Army after Sandhurst. In the assault on Snowdon East, Almond personally led a charge across open ground against the Japanese machine gun positions. He was wounded. He continued. He led a second assault the following day, again wounded. He led a third assault 2 days later, by which point he had been wounded 3 times and was described by his men as barely able to walk. He was killed in the third assault. He received the Victoria Cross posthumously. He was 22 years old, but the action that the Victoria Cross citation describes, the specific moment that the citation identifies as the act for which he was being decorated, was not one of the 3 assaults. It was a moment between the assaults when Almond alone personally attacked a Japanese machine gun post that was holding up the company's advance, killing the crew with his kukri at close range. The act that defined his citation was not the charge. it was the knife. And he was not unusual among the Gurkha officers and men of that campaign. He was the one who was seen doing it by enough people to write the citation. Now I want to ask the question that sits at the center of this story and that most accounts of the Gurkhas either avoid or answer too quickly. Why did they fight so hard? Not in the individual psychological sense. Why does any man choose to be brave at a specific moment? That question has an infinite number of answers, and most of them are true. I mean the structural question, the cultural question, the question that their history makes unavoidable. These were men from an independent kingdom who chose to fight for the British Empire, who chose to fight in a war that was not their country's war, who fought in that war with a consistency and ferocity that made them one of the most effective military formations. In the Allied order of battle, the simple answer, the one that British military tradition has always preferred, is that the Gurkhas fought because they were warriors, because their culture valued military service, because fighting was what they did and had always done. That answer is not wrong, but it is incomplete. The more complete answer requires sitting with something uncomfortable. The Gurkhas fought in part because fighting for the British Army was the best option available to them. Nepal was poor. The hills produced limited agricultural yield. The British Army paid in cash and pensions and land grants that represented real material improvement for a family from a hill village. The choice to enlist was a rational economic choice as well as a cultural one, and they were, until 1947 and the independence of India, fighting for an empire that did not regard them as equal to the white British soldiers alongside whom they fought. They were paid less. They received inferior medical care. In some campaigns, the British civilian and military establishment of the 1940s operated on racial assumptions that placed Gurkha soldiers in a complicated position, valued almost beyond any other troops, but valued in a framework that categorized them as a martial race, a type rather than as individual men with individual reasons. The honest verdict on the Gurkhas in the Second World War is that they were extraordinary soldiers who fought with exceptional courage in conditions that ranged from difficult to impossible for a set of reasons that included genuine loyalty and genuine martial culture, and genuine economic calculation and genuine complexity that cannot be reduced to any single narrative. The German captain above the Rapido River was not wrong about what he observed. His men were genuinely afraid. The fear was based on genuine capability. The capability was real and documented and consistent across 3 continents and 3 different enemy armies. But the men who produced that fear were not two-dimensional warriors from a military culture. They were men from specific villages in the hills of Nepal who had specific families and specific reasons and who had made specific choices in specific circumstances. Rifleman Lachaman Gurung was one of them. On May 12, 1945, in Burma, Lachaman Gurung's position was attacked by an estimated 200 Japanese soldiers at night. 3 grenades landed in his trench. He threw back the first 2. The third exploded in his hand before he could throw it. It blew off his fingers. It blew off his thumb. It destroyed much of his right hand. With his left hand, his non-dominant hand, he picked up his rifle. He defended his position alone for 4 hours. He killed 31 Japanese soldiers. He was awarded the Victoria Cross. He survived the war. He returned to Nepal. He applied for British citizenship in 2008. because his pension did not allow him to live adequately in Britain, where his family had settled. He was 92 years old. His application was rejected. It was later approved after a public campaign. He died in 2010. That is also the story of the Gurkhas. The full story, the one that the German captain's field report does not contain, the one that the Medal of Honor citations do not contain, the story that sits alongside the extraordinary military record and does not cancel it and is not canceled by it. Both are true. The most feared unit in the Second World War was not German. It was not American. It was not Russian. It came from the hills of Nepal. It was feared by the Afrika Korps in the Western Desert and by Kesselring's armies in the Italian mountains and by the Japanese army in the jungles of Burma. 3. Completely separate military cultures that reached the same conclusion independently and expressed it in their field reports and prisoner interrogations and post-war memoirs in almost identical terms. The terms were always about the night, about silence, about the kukri, about an enemy that did not behave as tactical doctrine predicted, about men who had decided something, about their own mortality that freed them from the constraint that limits most soldiers. What they had decided is not mystical. It is not the product of a warrior culture that is fundamentally different from any other human culture. It is the product of specific men in specific circumstances who had been prepared by their history and their training and their culture to do a specific thing. Very well. They had decided that the mission was the thing that mattered and that the cost to themselves was a variable they would not allow to affect the calculation. German captains wrote reports about it. Japanese soldiers wrote home about it. Field Marshal Kesselring wrote about it in his memoirs. All of them were describing the same thing. They were describing what it looks like from the outside when a man has genuinely stopped being afraid of you. It is the most frightening thing there is. And Lachaman Gurung, with his left hand, in the darkness in Burma in May 1945, defending a trench alone against 200 men for 4 hours after his right hand had been destroyed, was that thing in its purest form. He came home. He was 92 years old. He had to fight for the right to live in the country he had fought for. He deserved better. So did they all. If this story gave you something, the like button keeps it visible. It costs you nothing. For men like Lachaman Gurung, visibility is the only monument the record can still build. Subscribe for the next chapter. The Second World War was fought by many armies. In many places, the ones that history forgot are often the ones that deserve to be remembered most. The most feared unit in the war didn't have a flag anyone recognizes. They had a curved knife and a tradition that said, once drawn it must draw blood. They kept the tradition.